I never really pictured myself writing one of these posts. For as long as I can remember, I've been the kind of guy who scoffs at ghost stories and laughs at so-called unexplained events. I'd read a few spooky threads here on Reddit, rolling my eyes and assuming most of them were the product of overactive imaginations or people chasing internet fame. That changed a few nights ago. My name is Tom Preston, and what I'm about to share with you has turned my easygoing world into a haze of sleepless nights, double-check locks, and relentless second-guessing of everything I thought I knew. I'm not the superstitious type, but I have to admit, my hands are trembling at the keyboard right now. I've never been this rattled in my life. To give you a bit of background, I'm 28 years old, married to a wonderful woman named Sarah, and living in a suburban area called Redwood Heights. We've been here for about 3 years. It's the kind of place where folks nod at you on your morning jog, and kids ride their bikes on streets named after old mayors or local heroes. Nothing much happens here. At least, nothing I ever considered worth mentioning. We have a handful of local legends, mostly about abandoned buildings and rumored hauntings, but I always dismissed them as goofy urban myths designed to give the place some faux character. I drive for a rideshare company most nights to bring in some extra cash. That arrangement started about 6 months ago when my hours got cut at the marketing firm where I work during the day. My buddy James, who also drives part-time, told me it was a great way to pad my savings while I figure out my next move. The job isn't glamorous, it's a lot of waiting around, stopping for cheap coffee, and picking up college kids after they've had too many drinks downtown. The funny thing is, I used to brag that it was the perfect side gig. Nothing weird ever happens, I'd say. I just listen to music, drive people where they need to go, and rack up a little cash. In the past few days, I've replayed that statement in my head so many times, like a mocking echo I can't escape. The truth is, I was comfortable believing in a tidy, predictable world. Sure, I'd heard stories from other drivers about bizarre or uncomfortable encounters, a passenger who refused to speak, another who acted like they knew your entire life story. But I chalked them up to typical people are weird moments. I've had my fair share of odd rides, but never anything truly unsettling. Never anything that made me question what was real and what wasn't. Redwood Heights has always felt safe, almost to the point of being dull. If you walked its streets in the daytime, you'd see nothing but middle-class houses with well-kept lawns, a row of mom-and-pop shops on Main Street, and the old Redwood Theater that shows second-run movies for a couple of bucks. I remember the first time I heard talk of anything genuinely creepy in town. It was late September, about a month after I started driving for the rideshare company. I was grabbing a coffee at an all-night diner when the waitress, a sweet older lady named Vera, mentioned that haunted stretch of road by the train tracks on the southern edge of town. She lowered her voice like she was telling me a secret. "Folks see apparitions out there sometimes," she said, wiping down the counter. "My cousin swears she saw a woman standing in the middle of the street at 3 in the morning, wearing an old-fashioned coat and waving a handkerchief, but when my cousin slowed down, there was nobody there." I smiled politely and chalked it up to an overactive imagination, or maybe a desperate attempt to spook the new guy. Everyone in Redwood Heights knew that the southern outskirts were basically farmland, empty lots, and a few scattered businesses that had gone belly up decades ago. Nothing special, so I dismissed it without a second thought. Fast forward to last Friday. Sarah was working an overnight shift at the local hospital. She's a nurse on the trauma ward. And I had the car to myself for the entire night. I remember telling her, "I'll be fine, babe. Maybe I'll make good tips from the bar crowd." She kissed me on the cheek, told me to be safe, and left just after sundown. I was in a decent mood, feeling pretty optimistic about a quiet shift, maybe enough rides to help cover a couple of bills and stash something away for our vacation fund. If there was any tension in the air, I didn't notice it. One thing I do recall is that my phone started acting strange around 8 p.m. The battery, which I had charged to 100% just an hour earlier, suddenly dipped to 50%. I figured maybe I forgot to close some apps. Then, the Rideshare app crashed twice while I was scrolling for new passengers. That was unusual, but I shrugged it off as a glitch. I do keep a charging cable in the car, so I plugged in my phone, double-checked that everything was functioning, and set off on my usual route. Down Maple Avenue, toward the cluster of popular bars near Redwood University. On the way there, I had this fleeting moment where the streetlights seemed to flicker out of sync. You know how sometimes a light might buzz or go dim for half a second? That night, 4 or 5 in a row blinked off as I passed, one after another, so it almost looked like the darkness was trailing my car. It was weird, but again, I attributed it to nothing more than the city's old infrastructure. Redwood Heights might look shiny in parts, but our utilities are behind the times. By the time I reached the university area, everything felt normal again. The bustle of students lugging backpacks, a few groups already stumbling between parties, the flicker of neon signs in the windows of pubs. These familiar sights reminded me that I was still in the real world, not some ghost story. My first few rides were ordinary. A group of sophomore girls headed to a dance club, a quiet older couple returning from dinner. Each drop-off went smoothly, and I started to relax. I even put on some music. Classic rock, my go-to whenever I'm on the job. If someone doesn't like it, they'll usually just ask to change the station. But no one complained. The strange thing is, as the hours ticked by, I felt an odd heaviness in my chest. Maybe it was just the cold night air or the lonely drive between pickups, but I remember telling myself to lighten up. I'd read one too many r/no sleep posts, I thought. Or maybe I was just missing Sarah. I told myself I was being ridiculous. That feeling of mild dread kept nagging me, though, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Midnight came and went without any incident. James texted me to say he was having a slow night too, and we joked about switching to pizza delivery if the rides didn't pick up. Around 1 in the morning, I decided to head toward the quieter part of Redwood Heights, near the old Redwood Theater, figuring I might catch a passenger or two heading home from a late movie. Besides, the partiers near the university were either already at their destinations or still partying, meaning fewer quick pickups. On my way, I stopped at a gas station for a top-off and a cup of coffee. Black, 2 sugars. I remembered the station attendant gave me this hollow stare as I paid. His name tag said Brian, but he didn't speak a word. He just rang me up and pointed to the coffee station without any hint of a greeting. Glancing around, I noticed the station was oddly empty. No one else was there, and the overhead lights hummed in the stillness. I couldn't shake the creeping feeling that something wasn't right. That was when my phone buzzed again, announcing another ride request. A new address, on a side road I'd never heard of before, out near that abandoned diner everyone says is haunted. The place that once called itself Martha's Eatery. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another passenger in need of a lift, probably from some random trailer park or an Airbnb that was off the beaten path. Still, the address gave me a moment's pause. It seemed so isolated. My stomach churned the way it does when you realize you're heading into unfamiliar territory at an ungodly hour. But work is work, right? If only I'd known how that single ride request would change everything. If only I had listened to the small voice in the back of my head that said, "Hey Tom, maybe skip this one." But I didn't. And what happened next? Well, let's just say it's the reason I'm sitting here now, typing this out in the middle of the night, checking over my shoulder every few sentences to make sure I'm still alone. I stared down at the new ride request on my phone, the screen casting a pale glow across my car's interior. The address was 2302 Old Willow Lane, out near the fringes of Redwood Heights, close to the abandoned diner, Martha's Eatery. My breath caught for just a moment. I almost tapped cancel, but my pride wouldn't let me. I had never turned down a ride simply because of a weird feeling. Besides, it was a slow night and I needed the fare. So I took one last sip of my coffee, tried to shake off my nerves, and swiped accept. The drive out there was unsettling, to say the least. The street lights in the center of town were spaced closely together, but the further I got from Main Street, the more they thinned out. Eventually, I was cruising down near deserted roads lit only by my headlights. The darkness stretched on all sides, broken up by the shapes of skeletal trees and the occasional run-down storefront. I couldn't get my mind off the fact that Sarah was safe at the hospital, probably dealing with routine checkups or comforting anxious patients. Meanwhile, I was out here, chasing a pin on a map that led me into the backwoods of Redwood Heights. As I followed the GPS's mechanical voice, "In 0.5 miles, turn left," my radio started to sputter with static. The station I'd been listening to, some classic rock playlist, cut in and out. "Cliffs of," it said, then fizzled. I fiddled with the dial, but no matter how much I tried to retune it, all I got was an occasional crackling and a jumble of faint words I couldn't quite understand. Frustrated, I turned the volume down. That's when I noticed the GPS screen seemed to flicker each time my headlights passed under a tree branch. It almost looked like it was losing power in sync with the shadows overhead. My phone was still plugged in, so there was no way the battery was dying again. Yet, the whole system felt unstable. I told myself it was just my imagination, hardware issues, maybe even a simple software glitch. But the feeling in my gut said otherwise. It felt like the road itself wanted me to lose my way. I caught myself clutching the steering wheel too tightly, forcing my muscles to relax in an attempt to hide how tense I was. No one was around to see it, but my pride wouldn't let me appear frightened, not even to myself. After a few turns that led me farther from any recognizable landmarks, I finally spotted the diner, Martha's Eatery. The place was a relic. Its neon sign had long since burned out, leaving only the rusted metal frame. Torn posters clung to the windows. For an instant, I thought I saw movement inside, just a twitch of a dark shape passing behind the glass. But that made no sense. The place had been closed for something like 20 years if the rumors were true. The GPS told me to keep going another quarter mile. Sure enough, the gravel on the side of the road crunched under my tires as I neared a small clearing. In the weak beam of my headlights, I saw a single bench beneath a street lamp that flickered so rapidly it was almost strobing. A figure stood there, motionless, head down. At first, I thought it might be a man wearing a heavy coat, but as I pulled closer, I made out slender arms, long hair, possibly a woman. I slowed to a stop. I lowered the passenger side window a crack. "Hey, you called for a ride?" I said, my voice echoing in the stillness. The figure nodded slowly, so I unlocked the doors. The motion sensor picked up that the rear passenger door opened, but I couldn't see it happen in my peripheral vision. I just heard the faint click and shuffle. I glanced in the rearview mirror, trying not to stare. She wore a charcoal gray coat that seemed oddly outdated, like something you'd find in a vintage shop. Her hair fell in uneven waves around her face, partially obscuring her features. Maybe she was shy, or maybe she just didn't want to be recognized. I'd had plenty of passengers who valued anonymity, but there was something different about her. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't name. "Where are you headed?" I asked. The tension in my voice betrayed me, but I tried to keep it level. She didn't answer. I shifted in my seat, looking at the phone. The Rideshare app displayed a destination as home. No address, just home. That was unusual. Normally, you get at least a street name. Okay, I continued. Let's see if the GPS... Oh, looks like it's glitching. The phone's map had gone blank. All I had was a pulsing icon showing my car's location with no route. I sighed, tapped it a few times, but nothing happened. The woman in the back seat still said nothing. I heard her breathing, though, shallow but deliberate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "All right," I said, half turning in my seat. "If you can just give me a general direction, I'll do my best to—" I stopped mid-sentence. In the fleeting illumination of a passing car's high beams, I could see her face in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were downcast, but what struck me was how pale her skin looked, almost translucent in the reflection. And her coat, now that I could see more of it, appeared worn to the point of fraying at the seams. A faint odor reached me, like damp fabric left in a closet for too long. I exhaled slowly, turning my attention back to the phone in a last-ditch effort to salvage my route. My heart pounded, and I could practically taste the adrenaline in the back of my throat. The street lamp overhead continued its manic flickering. Something told me it wasn't going to get any better. Still, a job was a job. "I'll head toward Redwood Boulevard," I murmured, hoping she'd confirm or deny it. Nothing. I pulled back onto the road. The silence in the car was thick enough to choke on, so I tried for small talk. "Long night?" That's when the radio, which I'd turned down earlier, burst into a loud hiss. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Through the static, I thought I heard a faint voice, but I couldn't make out any words. My passenger finally stirred, adjusting herself in the seat. Her face turned slightly toward the window, as if she was watching the endless line of trees and close-up shops pass by. I was about to ask if everything was all right when my phone buzzed. A call from James. Relief surged in me for a split second. I could use a rational voice to calm my nerves. But the call immediately dropped the moment I tapped answer. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. I tried not to glance at the mirror too often, but I couldn't help it. Each time, the passenger looked different. Once, I swore her head was bowed at a more dramatic angle than before. Another time, I thought I saw her lips moving, but no sound came out. I wanted to turn on the overhead light to get a better look, but a fear gripped me so hard, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something deep inside told me that shining a light on whatever she was might make the situation infinitely worse. Before long, the GPS came back to life. It automatically routed me along a narrow street I hadn't noticed earlier, Foxglove Drive. I followed its robotic instructions, hoping it would lead me somewhere more populated. With each turn, though, the houses seemed darker, more spaced out, as if I were drifting into a part of town no one dared to remain in after nightfall. The sense of dread grew. There were no other cars on the road. Even the wind had died down, leaving a suffocating stillness behind. By the time I realized I'd made a full loop back toward the outskirts, I felt like my car was on autopilot. The same flickering street lamp from before came into view, and there stood the diner sign again, looming like a sentinel in the darkness. My heart hammered. Had I somehow circled right back? The phone beeped with a route recalculation message, but the passenger finally spoke. A single word, so soft I barely caught it. "Stop." Her voice had a crack in it that made goosebumps prickle across my skin. I braked, scanning the area. We were back near that lonely bench, the one where I'd picked her up, but she opened the door before I fully stopped. A rush of cold air swept in, carrying the faint smell of stale earth. My passenger stepped out. I leaned over, about to say something, maybe, "Wait, you forgot something?" or "Do you need help?" But the words never left my mouth. In the fraction of a second it took me to switch on the interior dome light, she was already gone. I mean, gone, like she'd vanished. No silhouette moving away from the car, no scuff of gravel underfoot, nothing. The door was wide open, but the road was empty. My pulse pounded so violently I felt faint. Hand shaking, I fumbled for the door handle and practically stumbled out of my seat, the car still in park with the engine running. The night air was cold, biting into my lungs. I scanned every direction, even peered under the bench, but she was nowhere. Only the flicker of that cursed street lamp and the rusted sign of Martha's Eatery in the distance. My mind raced, trying to piece together some logical explanation. Had she sprinted off? Was she some kind of track star? But there was no trace of footsteps, no sound of movement. I stood there calling out, "Hello? Are you okay?" Silence greeted me. In the hush that followed, I realized the radio static in my car had completely cut out, leaving an uneasy quiet that might have been worse than any sound at all. I stood there in the cold night air, feeling like the world around me had paused. The open door of my car swung slightly with a creak, as though coaxing me back inside. Part of me wanted to slam it shut, drive home, and never speak of what had just happened. Another part of me, that stubborn streak I'd always had, told me to keep looking, to find out if this bizarre encounter had some rational explanation, but my legs felt rooted to the ground, as if my body couldn't decide which impulse to follow. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I stepped away from the car, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. "Hello?" I called into the darkness once more. My breath billowed in front of me, forming small clouds in the flickering light. No answer. The silence was overwhelming, like a heavy weight on my ears. I took a few cautious steps around the bench. Beyond it, an overgrown dirt path disappeared into a cluster of tall pines. My phone's flashlight revealed nothing but a tangle of weeds and skeletal branches. There were no footprints, just my own scuffed tracks where I'd paced in confusion. If the passenger had run off, I would have seen disturbed leaves, broken twigs, or something, but there was nothing. Shaking, I returned to the car. The moment I sank into the driver's seat, I realized I'd left the engine running in my haste to find her. The radio was silent now. No static, no music, just the faint hum of the heater. The back door was still ajar. It clicked softly when I reached back and pulled it closed. My heart hammered, reminding me how easily it could have gone the other way, how easily I could have just driven away, ignoring the countless red flags that had been screaming at me all night. I glanced around the interior. The seat where she had been sitting looked as though no one had used it at all, no wrinkles, no trace of dirt. But in the faint glow of the dome light, I spotted a single white thread caught in the corner where the backrest met the cushion. It was so thin, I almost missed it. For reasons I can't fully explain, seeing that thread made my stomach churn. It felt like proof, tangible proof, that something physical had indeed been there, or someone. My immediate thought was to call Sarah, but what would I say? "Hey, honey, I just had a ghost in my car. Don't worry, though, she vanished into thin air." That'd go over well. Also, she was likely busy with patients, and I had no desire to distract her with a story that, frankly, I wasn't even sure I believed myself. So, I reached for my phone and tried calling James again instead. This time it rang 3 times before going to voicemail. No luck. Sighing, I checked the Rideshare app. The trip still showed as in progress, which made 0 sense. The passenger was gone. Shouldn't it have canceled? Or at least shown completed if she'd somehow ended the ride? I tapped End Trip manually, but the app froze. Then it crashed. My phone vibrated with an error message. Annoyed and more than a little spooked, I restarted it. The same glitch happened again. Finally, I gave up, tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, and decided I'd sort it out later. The drive home was a blur. Every dark corner, every patch of trees felt like it was hiding eyes that watched me. My thoughts drifted back to the stories I'd heard from Vera, the waitress at the diner downtown. Whispers about ghostly sightings near the old tracks. A figure in an outdated coat. I'd dismissed those as silly rumors, but I couldn't deny what I'd just experienced. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my nerves were shot. The porch light Sarah had left on seemed painfully bright compared to the night's darkness. I parked, stumbled out, and locked the car behind me. I half expected to feel that eerie chill in the air again, but all I felt was the crisp wind pushing against my jacket. It was almost comforting. Inside, the house was quiet. Sarah wouldn't be home for another few hours. I dropped my keys on the kitchen table, peeled off my jacket, and stood there in the dim glow of the hallway light, trying to decide what to do next. A million questions raced through my head. Who was that woman? Why did she vanish like that? Was I losing my mind? I made my way to the living room couch and practically collapsed into it. For several minutes, I just stared at the ceiling. My phone buzzed again. Another rideshare request? I grabbed it, but it was just a spam email. My heart rate, which had spiked at the vibration, gradually slowed. With a shaky breath, I clicked onto a web browser and typed Redwood Heights, Martha's Eatery, Ghost Story into a search engine. I felt silly doing it, but what else could I do? To my surprise, a few obscure forum posts popped up, mostly from years ago, people talking about unusual sightings near the diner, about an apparition of a woman in a tattered gray coat. Some insisted it was an urban legend, others swore on their lives they'd seen her. One post, dated almost a decade back, mentioned a local rumor that a woman had gone missing after leaving Martha's Eatery late one night in the 1960s. No one ever found her body. Her name was reportedly Evelyn Barnes. The date on the missing person's notice was 1962. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. A missing woman from the 1960s? A rumored ghost near the diner? It could all be a wild coincidence, sure, but it lined up disturbingly well with everything I'd just experienced. I saved a few screenshots of the forums, half afraid they would vanish if I didn't. My hands were clammy, and I realized I hadn't had a proper drink of water since that gas station coffee. My mouth felt like sandpaper. In the kitchen, I downed a glass of water, then another, my mind racing. It was nearly 4 a.m. now. I thought about trying to sleep, but the idea of closing my eyes and reliving that face in the rearview mirror made me shudder. Instead, I grabbed a notebook from the kitchen drawer and started jotting down every detail I could remember about the encounter, the ride request time, the way the GPS behaved, how the passenger looked and smelled, even the single word she'd spoken. Stop. The pen felt alien in my grip. I realized I hadn't handwritten this much since college. But it helped to put it all down in black and white, made it feel more concrete, like it wasn't just a nightmare I'd conjured up from too many horror movie marathons. As I scribbled, I noticed my handwriting became more agitated whenever I thought about the final seconds when she simply disappeared. Around 4:30, exhaustion overcame my fear. I trudged to the bedroom, flipped on the lamp, and tried to settle into bed. My mind wouldn't shut off. It kept playing that moment over and over. The open back door, the flickering street lamp, the hush of the night. Eventually, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, a jangling alarm on my phone jarred me awake. It was 7 a.m. Sarah would be home soon. I stumbled into the bathroom, eyes bleary. A glance in the mirror showed dark circles under my eyes and a general pallor that matched how I felt. Anxious, hollowed out. Just as I started splashing water on my face, I heard the front door open. "Tom?" Sarah's voice echoed through the house. "You home?" I wiped off my face, took a deep breath, and opened the bathroom door. She stood in the hallway, still in her scrubs, looking concerned. "You're up early," she said, eyeing me. "Are you okay? You look like you barely slept." I managed a shaky smile, trying to sound casual. "Rough night?" I said. "I'll tell you about it." She followed me into the kitchen, where I started making coffee more out of habit than desire. I watched her expression as I recounted some of the events, careful not to delve into every supernatural detail, but hinting at enough weirdness to convey how disturbed I was. I told her about picking up a passenger near the abandoned diner, about how quiet she was, and how the app glitched. I left out the vanishing act. For now, anyway. Sarah furrowed her brow. "That's strange," she said, pulling a box of cereal from the cabinet. "You didn't feel safe calling me?" I shrugged, my eyes on the coffee maker. "I didn't want to bother you at work. Plus, I wasn't sure how to explain it." She nodded, though her gaze lingered on me, clearly sensing there was more to the story. "Well, you can catch up on sleep today, but maybe call James, or even the rideshare support. Something about that app glitching? Doesn't sound right." I mumbled something in agreement, but my thoughts were 1,000 miles away. My phone buzzed again on the counter. This time, it was a text from James. I picked it up, my heart skipping a beat. The message read, "Dude, you good? Tried calling you last night. Weird stuff on my end. Let me know if you're okay." Weird stuff on his end? My pulse quickened. Had James experienced something similar? Or had he just gotten static and thought his phone was messing up? My mind whirled. This wasn't just me losing it. Something real was happening. Something I had to get to the bottom of. As Sarah poured her cereal, I took my phone and stepped away to text James back, feeling an urgent need for answers. I was determined to figure out who or what had climbed into my car last night and why she seemed so hell-bent on leading me to that abandoned diner before disappearing into the darkness. I stepped into the living room with my phone in hand, heart thudding as I read James's text over and over. "Dude, you good? Tried calling you last night. Weird stuff on my end. Let me know if you're okay." My mind churned. Weird stuff on my end could mean a lot of things, but given what I'd been through, it felt like a flashing red signal. Had James encountered the same silent passenger? Or something just as unnerving? Sarah watched me pace. I offered a vague reassurance. Something like, "Don't worry, I'll handle it." But the truth was, I didn't know how to handle this. All I knew was that I wasn't alone in dealing with whatever lurked near Martha's Eatery. I texted James back, telling him I'd meet him at the diner parking lot around dusk. It was a risk, but I had to know. Something inside me demanded closure, even if that closure was terrifying. He quickly replied, "Okay, sunset. Bring a flashlight." As the day dragged on, my nerves ratcheted up. I pretended to nap for Sarah's sake, but each time I closed my eyes, I saw that passenger's pale face reflected in my rearview mirror. It felt like she was burning into my mind, a specter that wouldn't rest until I acknowledged her. Eventually, I told Sarah I needed to check on something for work, grabbed my jacket, and slipped out the door. I arrived at the abandoned diner just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruise-colored hues of purple and red. The battered sign for Martha's Eatery loomed like a skeletal arm, creaking in a light wind. Gravel crunched under my shoes as I parked and stepped out. My headlights swept across the boarded-up entrance, revealing weathered planks and tattered posters. Nobody else was around. Then I saw James's car. It was parked a few dozen feet away, half hidden by a dead tree. He was leaning against it, arms crossed, flashlight in hand. The moment he spotted me, he waved me over. His face had the same haunted look I'd probably been wearing all day. "Man, you look rough," he said, but there was no humor in his tone. "Something's up with this place, Tom. After I tried calling you last night, I don't know, my phone went haywire. Then, on my way home, I swear I saw someone in my rearview mirror. But when I turned around, the back seat was empty." A chill ran down my spine. It was exactly what I'd experienced. A woman?" I asked, voice trembling. He nodded grimly. "Yeah. Or something that looked like a woman. Old coat, real quiet. The second I tried to talk to her, she vanished. Thought I'd lost my damn mind until you said you had a weird night too." We stood there in silence for a moment, the distant chirp of crickets the only sound. Finally, I cleared my throat. "Look, I did some digging. There's this local legend about a missing woman named Evelyn Barnes. Disappeared in 1962, last seen leaving this diner. People say she wanders these roads trying to get home." James exhaled, shining his flashlight at the diner's entrance. "And we're here. Why?" I swallowed, because I need to know what she wants. I can't keep driving, waiting for her to appear in my back seat again. James stared at me, then flicked his flashlight to the rusted lock on the diner's door. "Guess we'd better take a look inside." The door gave way with a few well-placed shoves. The interior was a cavern of shadows, the only light coming from our flashlights, and the last traces of dusk filtering through grime-streaked windows. Torn vinyl seats lined the booths, and a long counter stretched across the front. Broken glass crunched under my shoes, possibly old plates or windows that had shattered ages ago. "Smells like mold," James muttered, covering his nose. We ventured deeper. Every shape in the flashlight beam looked menacing. The toppled stools, the rotting wooden door to the kitchen, the streaks of graffiti on the walls. The deeper we moved, the colder it seemed to get, as though the building itself was exhaling an icy breath. In the back, we found a narrow hallway that led to a small office. The door was ajar, revealing a dusty desk piled with old receipts and newspapers. My heart pounded as I noticed a framed photo on the wall. A black and white snapshot of a group of customers smiling at the camera. Martha's Eatery was once thriving, it seemed. Then my flashlight fell on a lone figure in the photo. Her hair pinned in an old-fashioned style, wearing a charcoal gray coat that looked hauntingly familiar. Could it be Evelyn? "Dude," James whispered, shining his light on the same photo. "Is that?" I nodded wordlessly. The woman's eyes in the photo seemed to bore right into me, even though they were lost in half-tone grayscale. A jolt of fear twisted my gut, but I forced myself to keep steady. Slowly, we rifled through the mess on the desk. Most of the papers were water-damaged or eaten by time. Then James found a binder of clipped articles and letters. The topmost newspaper clipping read, "Local woman missing. Evelyn Barnes, last seen leaving Martha's Eatery, March 15th, 1962. A wave of nausea hit me. It was too real. There was even a grainy photo of Evelyn, confirming my worst suspicions. The same coat, the same distant expression. "She never made it home that night," James said quietly, "and she's still trying." I started to answer, but a sudden noise echoed through the diner, a metallic screech, like a heavy object dragging across the floor. We spun around, flashlights darting across the walls. My heart thundered in my chest. In the corridor we'd just come down, something moved. My beam caught a fleeting glimpse of a shape, tall, hunched, drifting through shadows. James grabbed my arm. "What was that?" he hissed. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry and every instinct told me to run, but some morbid curiosity pinned me in place. We inched forward, flashlights trembling, until we returned to the main dining area. Standing near a booth by the window was a figure in a tattered gray coat, pale hair partially obscuring her face. She was facing away, shoulders slumped as if in sorrow or exhaustion. I felt James' grip tighten on my arm. The temperature plummeted, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me. "Hello," I managed to say, my voice cracking. Slowly, painfully, she turned. Her eyes were hollow, like two black pits set into a drawn, colorless face. A single tear traced down her cheek, but it looked more like murky water than anything human. My entire body locked up with terror. I fought the urge to bolt, but some primal part of me understood this was a chance to free her, or be consumed by her despair. "Eveline?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She lifted an arm and pointed toward the door. For a split second, I thought she was telling us to leave, but then I realized she was pointing beyond the door, toward something else. The gesture was deliberate, an almost agonized motion. James and I exchanged a glance, then, with shaky steps, followed her direction. A door near the kitchen we'd overlooked earlier led to a set of stairs descending into a cellar. The smell of damp earth and mildew washed over us the second we opened it. My flashlight wavered down the steps, revealing stone walls and a dirt floor. I heard James mutter a curse under his breath, but we continued downward, compelled by a grim sense that we were close to some hidden truth. At the bottom, our beams scanned the cramped space. Broken crates, old cans, and a tangle of cobwebs. In the far corner was a shape covered by a threadbare tarp. James approached, heart pounding so loud I could hear it, matching my own. He pulled back the tarp and I nearly dropped my flashlight. Underneath, laid a bundle of rotted clothes and bones. Human remains by the look of it. My stomach lurched. There was no mistaking the decayed strands of hair, the once gray fabric now stained dark with age. A battered purse lay beside the remains, half buried in the dirt. "Oh, God," James whispered, eyes wide. "Is this?" But we already knew. It had to be Evelyn Barnes. She never made it out of the diner that night, not alive. Whether it was foul play or some other tragedy, her corpse had been hidden here for decades. A horrible wailing noise erupted from behind us, echoing off the cellar walls. We spun around. Evelyn's apparition stood at the foot of the stairs, eyes fixed on her own earthly remains. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, and her face contorted in anguish. The temperature dropped so fast I felt ice forming in my nostrils. Then came a gust of wind so strong it knocked me backward, sending me sprawling into the dirt. James grabbed my arm, tried to pull me up. Through the swirling dust we saw her fade in and out, flickering like a broken projection. Her hand reached out toward the bones, a tortured gesture of longing. In the confusion we scrambled for the stairs, minds reeling with terror. As we did, her wail rose to a mind-shattering pitch, freezing my blood. It felt like she was pulling at our very souls, demanding we acknowledge her pain. We stumbled up the steps, slammed the cellar door behind us, and tore through the diner toward the front entrance. The second we burst outside, gasping in the night air, the noise cut off. Silence wrapped around us like a suffocating blanket. We stumbled into the gravel lot, hearts pounding. There was no sign of Evelyn's spirit now. Just the ancient diner, stoic and brooding under the moonlight. James and I locked eyes. Neither of us could speak at first. Finally, between shaky breaths, he said, "We have to call the police, or someone. She's been down there for decades." I nodded, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. "We'll report it," I whispered. "She deserves that much." We drove away without another word, leaving Martha's Eatery in our rearview mirrors. The authorities would find the remains and, hopefully, put Evelyn Barnes to rest once and for all. But even as I sit here writing this, the memory of her tortured face haunts me. Every time my phone buzzes with a rideshare alert, my heart leaps into my throat. Because some part of me fears that, until the truth is fully laid to rest, she might still be out there, waiting for another unsuspecting driver, drifting in the glow of a flickering street lamp, hoping for one final ride home.